Hello, learners. My name is Dr. Leah Kaler, and we are going to be talking about legal competencies today. Legal competencies refer to the specific abilities and cognitive functions required for an individual to participate meaningfully in legal proceedings. These competencies are evaluated in forensic psychology to determine whether an individual can understand and engage in the legal process, make reasoned decisions about their case, and manage the consequences of legal outcomes. Different types of legal competencies are assessed depending upon the context, such as competency to stand trial, decision making capacity, or the ability to understand and waive legal rights. Some key aspects of legal competencies: the individual must be able to comprehend the nature and purpose of the legal proceedings, including the roles of the judge, the jury, the attorney. They should be able to follow courtroom procedures and understand the charges against them. The individual needs to be able to engage with their legal counsel, provide relevant information, and follow advice related to their defense strategy. They must be able to make decisions about plea deals, testify in court, or decide whether to accept a plea agreement. Competency includes the ability to weigh the potential outcomes of legal decisions, such as accepting a plea deal versus going to trial. The individual should be able to understand and appreciate the consequences of their decisions. The person must be able to grasp the implications of various legal outcomes, such as sentencing, parole conditions, or court-ordered treatment. This includes maintaining appropriate court behavior, understanding and following legal instructions, and interacting effectively with legal professionals. So let's talk about a couple of reasons why legal competencies may be purposefully vague. So, vagueness allows for flexibility in assessing competencies based on specific context and individual circumstances. Legal standards are designed to be broad to accommodate various cases and conditions. This flexibility helps to ensure that the assessment can be tailored to the unique needs of each case, accounting for different levels of cognitive and emotional functioning. Legal competencies can vary widely among individuals due to differences in mental health conditions, intellectual functioning, and personal circumstances. A broad and somewhat vague definition allows forensic psychologists to consider the diverse ways in which individuals may struggle with legal processes, ensuring a more individualized assessment. Legal standards and definitions evolve over time, reflecting change in societal views, legal precedents, and psychological research. The purposefully vague nature of legal competencies allows the legal system to adapt to these changes without needing constant revisions to specific legal criteria. The vagueness also helps to avoid overly rigid criteria that may not capture the full spectrum of an individual's abilities or impairments. If legal competencies were too narrowly defined, they may exclude individuals who are struggling in less obvious ways but still require support or intervention. A vague definition encourages forensic psychologists to conduct thorough and nuanced evaluations instead of relying on strict criteria. Psychologists are prompted and encouraged to consider a range of factors and use their professional judgment to determine competency. This approach supports a more comprehensive understanding of the individual's abilities and needs. By following some degree of vagueness, the legal system can better accommodate individuals with diverse conditions and backgrounds, ensuring that those who may not neatly fit into predefined categories still receive fair and just consideration. Human behavior and mental functioning are very complex and multifaceted. Purposeful vagueness in legal competencies acknowledges that there is no one size fits all approach to understanding and assessing legal capacities. It reflects the complexity of human cognition and the need for a nuanced approach to evaluation. Let's talk about what threshold determination means. In the context of legal competencies, this refers to the process of establishing whether an individual meets the minimum criteria required to demonstrate a particular legal competence. This determination is a critical step in forensic evaluations especially when assessing whether someone is competent to stand trial, make informed decisions, or understand the legal proceedings. So, a few key aspects that we need to talk about are the threshold is the minimum level of cognitive and functional ability needed to meet specific legal competency required. For example, to be deemed competent to stand trial, an individual must have a certain level of understanding and capacity, which serves as the baseline or threshold for competency. Each type of legal competency has specific standards and criteria that define the threshold. These standards are typically set by legal statutes, case law, and legal precedents. For instance, the threshold for competency to stand trial usually involves the ability to understand the nature of the proceedings and assist in one's own defense. Forensic psychologists evaluate whether individuals meet these competency thresholds through various different methods, including clinical interviews, psychological testing, and review of collateral information. The assessment aims to determine if the individual's cognitive and emotional functioning meets or exceeds the established legal criteria. The threshold determination involves evaluating specific components of competency, such as understanding the legal process. So the individual must be able to grasp the purpose and proceedings of the trial. The person must be able to assist in their defense. They have to be able to collaborate with their attorney and provide relevant information. And they also need to be capable of making reasoned decisions about their case. Meeting the threshold does not necessarily mean the individual is fully competent in all areas. Rather, it indicates that they meet the minimum requirements for legal participation. If an individual meets the threshold but has other impairments, accommodations or further interventions may be necessary. So, a few different competencies, and we are going to talk about this much more in our time together here and in future lectures. But we have competency to stand trial. That threshold includes understanding charges, court procedures, and the ability to work with an attorney. Then we've got competency to waive rights. The individual must understand the nature of the rights they are waiving and the consequences of waiving them. Also, competency to make informed decisions. This person has to be able to appreciate the implications of the legal decisions, such as accepting a plea deal. Some challenges with the threshold determination. Determining whether someone meets the threshold can be subjective and vary depending upon the evaluator's judgment and the individual's specific situation. For legal standards, competency might differ from clinical definitions of mental health, requiring forensic psychologists to balance legal requirements with clinical observations. So, a few examples of threshold determination, specifically whenever it comes to competency to stand trial, as that is going to be our focus here today, is that the legal standard to be deemed competent to stand trial, an individual must have a sufficient understanding of the proceedings and the ability to assist their defense. The threshold is often described as having a basic understanding of the legal process and being able to communicate effectively with legal counsel. A forensic psychologist might use structured interviews and a standardized test to evaluate this. We want to know, does the individual comprehend the roles of court personnel and the nature of the charges? Can they work with their attorney to formulate a defense strategy? Are they capable of making informed decisions about plea deals or trial options? If the individual meets these criteria, they are considered to have surpassed the competency threshold. If not, further evaluation and possible interventions are needed, which we will talk about here in future slides. So, to wrap it all up, the threshold determination is a critical element in assessing legal competencies, ensuring that the individual meets the minimum criteria required for meaningful participation in legal processes. This determination involves evaluating whether the individual's cognitive and functional abilities meet the established legal standards, which can vary depending upon the specific competency that is being assessed. The process balances legal requirements with clinical observations to ensure fair and accurate evaluations in the forensic setting. So, competencies are assessed through different frameworks that help the psychologist understand the individual's cognitive, emotional, and psychological functioning in relation to their legal situation. So, we are going to cover 5 of these competencies today, and the various different components are going to be functional, causal, interactive, judgmental, and dispositional. So, first, let's talk about functional component. The functional component refers to the individual's ability to perform specific tasks or functions related to their case. In forensic evaluations, functional competence is a primary focus because it assesses whether the individual can meaningfully engage with their legal situation. So, competency to stand trial is one of the most common functional competencies that are evaluated by forensic psychologists. This involves determining whether the defendant has the mental capacity to understand the nature and the purpose of legal proceedings and whether they can assist in their own defense. So, the psychologist assesses whether the individual can understand legal terms and concepts, the role of the judge, the jury, the attorney, comprehend the charges and the possible consequences, and engage with legal counsel in a meaningful way. The psychologist will use tools like interviews, psychological tests, and behavioral observations to determine whether the individual meets the functional requirements needed for their case. If the defendant cannot perform these functions, they may be deemed incompetent to stand trial. So the examiner must observe the forensically related behaviors for themselves. When determining what to assess for, you may look to theory, empirical observations, or legal requirements, and sometimes these can conflict. So let's move on to the causal component, and this involves understanding the underlying causes or contributing factors to the individual's functional impairment. This is crucial in forensic psychology because it helps establish why a person may lack the necessary competencies and whether these causes are temporary or if they're permanent. So, how this applies to forensic psychology? Well, first, let's talk about mental disorders. Forensic psychologists must assess whether a mental illness, intellectual disability, neurological condition, or substance use disorder is the cause of the functional impairment. For instance, a defendant may be unable to understand the legal process due to severe psychosis, major depression, or cognitive deficits. For example, if a person with schizophrenia is exhibiting delusions, the psychologist must determine if these delusions are the reason the person is unable to comprehend their legal rights. Forensic psychologists must be able to differentiate between temporary conditions, such as substance use intoxication or situational stress, versus chronic conditions, such as developmental disorders or severe mental illness. This distinction is important because it can affect the legal strategy, such as whether the individual can regain competency through treatment. In some cases, causal competence involves understanding how a medical condition, say for example a brain injury or dementia, contributes to an individual's impairment. Once functional deficits are identified, theory and research will yield hypotheses for these causes. The hypotheses are tested utilizing current best clinical practices, and the data is reported to the court with explanatory interpretations relevant to the forensically relevant behavior. Next is the interactive component, and this relates to the individual's ability to interact appropriately and meaningfully with their legal counsel, courtroom personnel, or during the evaluation process. It goes beyond mere functional ability, focusing on the quality of communication and interpersonal interactions. Forensic psychologists need to be able to evaluate whether the individual can communicate effectively with their attorney, providing relevant information for their defense, and following legal advice. A defendant with severe social anxiety or, for example, autism spectrum disorder may struggle to engage appropriately, affecting their legal representation. The individual must be able to present themselves in court appropriately, following decorum, and not displaying behavior that could be harmful to their case, for example, having inappropriate outbursts. The psychologist assesses whether conditions such as mania, personality disorders, or impulse control disorders interfere with the individual's ability to interact. Individuals with impaired social cognition, such as those with intellectual disabilities or neurodevelopmental disorders, may struggle to interact appropriately in legal settings. Forensic psychologists assess whether the individual can follow courtroom procedures, respond to questions, and demonstrate an understanding of the social norms of these contexts. So let's talk a little bit about the United States versus Wilson in 1966. This is a significant case in the context of forensic psychology and legal competency. This case addressed the issue of competency to stand trial, and it established important principles regarding the evaluation of mental capacity in the criminal justice system. So, Wilson was charged with a crime, and during the trial process, his defense raised concerns about his mental competency. Specifically, they argued that Wilson was not competent to stand trial due to his mental state. The court was tasked with determining whether Wilson was mentally competent to face the charges against him. The primary legal issue in this case was whether the court had appropriately evaluated Wilson's mental competency. The defense contended that the trial court had not properly assessed Wilson's ability to understand the proceedings and assist in his own defense. The Supreme Court ruled that the trial court had a duty to ensure that Wilson was competent to stand trial. The court held that there is a significant question regarding an individual's competence. The trial court must make an explicit finding on the issue of competence. The court also emphasized that the defendant's mental competence is crucial for a fair trial, and the failure to properly assess competency could violate the defendant's rights. So let's talk about the significance and implications of this particular case. US v. Wilson reinforced the principle that a defendant must be competent to stand trial. Competency is defined as the ability to understand the nature and purpose of the legal proceedings and to assist in one's own defense. This case highlighted the court's responsibility to ensure that these criteria are met. The decision in Wilson established that the court must make a clear and explicit determination regarding a defendant's competency. This decision underscores the judiciary duty to thoroughly evaluate and address any concerns about mental competency to ensure the fairness of the trial process. The ruling emphasized the importance of due process rights. A defendant who is not competent to stand trial cannot participate meaningfully in their defense and thus cannot be tried fairly. The court's decision in Wilson ensures that the defendant's rights to a fair trial are protected by requiring adequate assessments of competency. The case underscored the necessity for forensic evaluations and expert testimony in determining competency. When there are doubts about a defendant's mental state, courts must rely on psychological assessments to inform their decisions. This case set a precedent for how courts should handle issues of competency. It established guidelines for ensuring that defendants who are unable to understand the legal proceedings or assist in their own defense are not subjected to trial. Another landmark case that we're going to discuss here is Fair v. Michael C., 1979. This case involved a 16-year-old named Michael C., who was on probation for several criminal offenses. When the police questioned Michael about a nearby murder, he requested to have his probation officer present with him. The police refused, and Michael agreed to speak without an attorney. During the interrogation, Michael made statements and drew sketches that incriminated him. Michael was charged with the murder and moved to suppress the statements that he made during the interrogation, but the motion was denied. That case established the following criteria: that a juvenile's request for a probation officer during the questioning does not invoke their Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. When determining if a juvenile waived their right to remain silent, courts must consider the totality of the circumstances. Factors to consider include the juvenile's age, their education, their background, their intelligence, and their ability to understand warnings. And the consequences of waiving their rights should also be considered. So, when we are assessing this particular component, we need to know the context. You will often need to ask for more information than what is typically given to you at the onset. And the forensic tools were not necessarily developed to test the interactive component. So, you may have to be creative and ask above and beyond to really understand and be able to assess this component. So let's briefly stop here and reflect and ask ourselves some questions. What is it that we need in the context? What can the defendant do and what they cannot do in context? And why? How much of a discrepancy is there between the needs and the capacity? So the ultimate legal question here is the discrepancy sufficient to warrant a finding of incompetence? So let's continue to look at a few more components here. Judgmental competence refers to the individual's ability to make sound, rational decisions related to their case and legal strategy. This is critical when individuals must make decisions that affect the outcome of their legal situation, such as pleading guilty, testifying in court, or accepting a plea deal. Forensic psychologists must assess whether the individual can weigh the pros and cons of different legal options. For example, can the defendant understand the consequences of accepting a plea deal versus going to trial? If they are incapable of grasping these concepts, is it due to delusions, cognitive impairment, or mood disturbances? Their judgmental competence is going to be impaired. Conditions such as bipolar disorder, especially during a manic episode, or potentially borderline personality disorder, may interfere with rational decision making. The forensic psychologist assesses whether the individual is influenced by impulsivity, emotional instability, or irrational thought processes. A key area where judgmental competency is evaluated is in the defendant's ability to waive constitutional rights, which we're going to talk about more in a future lecture. So, that is their ability to remain silent or the right to a lawyer. And the forensic psychologist must determine whether the individual's decision to waive these rights was voluntary and informed. So, whenever we are going to be doing assessments, we need to consider a few things. Don't try to establish cutoffs for legal competency. Evaluate the abilities against the needs, as we just talked about. Report the discrepancies, and then leave the judgment to the legal actor responsible for reaching a decision. This is often the judge. Dispositional competence. This involves the individual's ability to understand and appreciate the consequences of various legal dispositions or decisions. It focuses on whether the individual is capable of making reasoned decisions regarding their legal outcomes, such as sentencing, parole, or treatment options. Forensic psychologists evaluate whether the individual can comprehend the potential legal outcomes and their actions. This includes the ability to appreciate the long term consequences of being convicted, being found not guilty by reason of insanity, or being civilly committed. In cases where sentencing or parole decisions are being made, forensic psychologists assess whether the individual can understand the stipulations of their sentence. Perhaps that looks like conditions of parole and consequences of violating these conditions. Dispositional competence is also relevant when the individual is faced with decisions about court ordered treatment, such as psychiatric hospitalization or therapy. Can the person understand the nature of the treatment and make informed decisions about whether to comply? This is especially important in cases where an individual is given the option of treatment as an alternative to incarceration. So, with regard to assessment considerations, Sometimes dispositions are automatic and will not involve any input from the examiner. In some cases, the examiner may be asked to provide recommendations for restoration of competency or potentially some type of plan B. Please note that you will often see adjudicative competency referred to as competency to stand trial, but bear in mind that one must be competent to proceed in all aspects of the adjudicative process. So that means pleading guilty, waiving Miranda rights, fitness to proceed with pre-adjudicative or adjudicative process, aka mental state at the time of the trial, can be raised at any point in time during adjudication before or during, and that the defendant's mental status could be questioned. This can be raised by the court, the defense, or the prosecution. So let's talk about the competency doctrine. English common law has had a significant influence on the development of legal concepts, including competency to stand trial, in jurisdictions that follow the common law tradition, such as the United States. Here is an in depth example of how English common law addresses competency to stand trial, and we're going to talk about its impact on the modern legal system. So let's talk particularly about the origin and the historical context. English common law originated in medieval England and developed through judicial decisions and precedents rather than statutory laws. It is based on customs, traditions, and judicial opinions of the court over time. The common law system evolved gradually, with principles and doctrines being refined through judicial decisions. The concept of competency to stand trial emerged as part of a broader development of procedural fairness and legal rights. In early English common law, the concept of competency to stand trial was less formally defined, but involved principles related to the defendant's mental capacity and ability to participate in legal proceedings. Historical English common law recognized that individuals with severe mental disorders might be incapable of understanding the nature of the proceedings or assisting in their defense. Such individuals were deemed not competent to stand trial. Common law principles emphasize the right to a fair trial, which includes the requirement of defendants they must be able to understand and participate in their own trial. This principle underpins the modern concept of competency to stand trial. Common law courts have historically exercised discretion to ensure that trials are fair and that defendants are competent to participate, aligning in the broader principle of justice. Defendants must have a basic understanding of the charges against them and the nature of the legal proceedings. The defendants must be able to communicate effectively with their attorney and participate in their defense. Defendants must be capable of making reasoned decisions about their case. And the court has a responsibility to assess and ensure competency of defendants, reflecting the common law's commitment to fairness and justice. So let's talk about the common law's influence on the modern legal system. The U.S. legal system, which follows the common law tradition, has adopted and adapted principles of competency to stand trial. The modern standard for competency in the United States is based on precedents set by English common law, but has been formalized and clarified through landmark cases and statutes. We're going to talk much more in depth about it, but just to touch on it here, the Dusky Standard. This is the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in the Dusky versus the United States 1960 trial. This established a formal standard for adjudicative competency, requiring defendants to have a rational and factual understanding of the proceedings and to be able to assist in their defense. This standard reflects the evolution of common law principles into a more structured legal framework. And then modern competency standards in jurisdictions following the common law tradition are influenced by historical principles, but have been refined through judicial decisions and statutory law to address specific issues related to mental health and legal competencies. Contemporary legal systems incorporate procedural safeguards to ensure that defendants who are not competent to stand trial are not subjected to unfair legal proceedings, and these safeguards are built upon the common law's emphasis on justice and fairness. So now that we have a very historical understanding all the way back from medieval England, we're going to fast forward and we're going to talk, as I mentioned, more in depth here about the Dusky Standard. This is a landmark case from the U.S. Supreme Court, Dusky v. the United States. It took place in 1960, and it established a crucial standard for determining competency to stand trial. This case significantly shaped how competency is assessed within the legal system. Just a bit of background about the case. Ralph Dusky was convicted of a federal crime, but his defense argued that he was not competent to stand trial due to his mental state. Dusky's defense contended that he lacked the capacity to understand the proceedings and assist in his defense. The trial court did not fully address these concerns, and Dusky was convicted. The central issue was whether the legal standard for determining competency to stand trial was adequately defined and whether Dusky's trial should have been halted due to his alleged incompetence. The Supreme Court of the United States overturned Dusky's conviction, holding that the trial court had applied an inadequate standard for determining competence. The court established a clear and specific standard for assessing competency to stand trial. So now we have developed the standard established in Dusky v. United States. So the defendant must have a, quote, rational and factual understanding, unquote, of the proceedings against them. With regard to rational understanding, the defendant must be able to comprehend the legal process and the charges being brought. This means having a coherent grasp of the nature of the trial and its proceedings. With regard to factual understanding, the defendant must understand the factual aspects of the case, including the evidence presented and the potential consequences. The defendant must also be able to assist their defense with a reasonable degree of understanding. This includes they need to be able to communicate effectively with their attorney, and the defendant should be able to contribute meaningfully to their defense, including making informed decisions about the case, such as whether to testify or accept a plea deal. So let's talk about the impact of the Dusky Standard. The Dusky Standard clarified that competency to stand trial is not just about the understanding of legal terms, but also about the defendant's ability to participate in their own defense and comprehend the trial proceedings. The ruling provided a uniform standard for assessing competency, which helps ensure consistency in how competency issues are addressed across different jurisdictions. By setting a clear standard, the Dusky decision helps to protect the rights of defendants, ensuring that individuals who are unable to understand and participate in their trial are not subjected to unfair legal processes. The decision guides lower courts and forensic evaluators in assessing competency, emphasizing the need for both rational and factual understanding, as well as the ability to assist in one's own defense. This case underscores the importance of mental health evaluations in determining competency, highlighting the role of the forensic psychologists and psychiatrists in providing expert assessments. So, in conclusion, Dusky v. the United States is a seminal case in the realm of criminal law, establishing the standard for adjudicative competency. The standard requires the defense to be able to have a rational and factual understanding of the proceedings and be able to assist in their own defense. This standard ensures that the defendants are capable of participating meaningfully in their trial, thereby upholding the fairness and integrity of the judicial process. The decision has had a lasting impact on competency assessments, guiding courts and mental health professionals in ensuring the defendant's rights are protected and the legal proceedings are conducted justly. So, having one standard, the Dusky, regardless of the context, did generate some confusion. And so, this brings us to our next seminal case, Godinez v. Moran, 1993. Again, this is a significant U.S. Supreme Court case that addressed the competency standards for defendants who wish to waive their right to legal representation and represent themselves at trial. This case specifically dealt with the relationship between competency to stand trial and competency to waive counsel. So, just a few facts about the case. Hector Godinez was charged with murder and faced trial in California. He expressed a desire to represent himself, waiving his right to an attorney. The trial court, however, was concerned about his mental competence and conducted a competency hearing. The trial court found that Godinez was competent to stand trial, but was unsure whether his competence to waive his rights to counsel. The court decided to proceed with a trial by allowing him to represent himself. He was convicted. His conviction was appealed on the grounds that competency standard for waiving counsel was not adequately addressed. The key issue was whether the standard for determining a defendant's competency to stand trial also applies to determining their competency to waive the right to legal representation. Specifically, the court had to decide whether the defendant, who is competent to stand trial, is also necessarily competent to waive counsel and represent themselves. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the standard for competency to stand trial is the same as the standard for competency to waive the right to counsel. The court held that a defendant who is competent to stand trial is also competent to make the decision to represent themselves. So let's talk about a couple of key points with this particular case. The Supreme Court ruled that the standard for determining competency to stand trial, established in the Dusky case, is also the standard for evaluating competency to waive the right to counsel. This means that the defendant must have a rational and factual understanding of the proceedings to be able to assist in their own defense. The ruling emphasized that a defendant is deemed competent to understand the charges and assist in their defense, and they are also presumed capable of making an informed decision to waive their right to legal representation. The decision clarified that no additional or separate competency standard is required for a defendant to waive their right to counsel beyond being competent to stand trial. The ruling reinforces the principle that defendants have the constitutional right to represent themselves if they are competent to stand trial. This aligns with the court's earlier decision in Ferretta v. California, 1975, which recognized the right to self-representation. The court must ensure that defendants who wish to waive their right to counsel understand the consequences of self-representation, are competent to make this decision. The decision affirms that the existing competency standards are sufficient to evaluate both trial competency and the legal competency to waive counsel. And the ruling ensures the competency is how competency is assessed across different contexts. Courts and forensic evaluators apply the same standard to determine whether a defendant can stand trial and whether they can waive their right to legal representation. So, courts and forensic evaluators must apply the same standard to determine whether a defendant can stand trial and whether they can waive their right to legal representation. I made reference to this earlier, but I want to give you a little bit more information about the Ferretta v. California case. This was a significant case in the United States constitutional law decided by the Supreme Court. It established the right of a criminal defendant to represent themselves in state criminal trials, provided they do so knowingly and competently. So, a little background about the case. Anthony Ferretta was charged with a felony in California. He requested to represent himself in court, waiving his right to legal counsel. The trial court denied his request, citing concerns about his ability to adequately defend himself. The central issue in this case was whether the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution, which guarantees the right to counsel, also implicitly guarantees the right to a defendant's self-representation. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, held that the Sixth Amendment does indeed include the right to self-representation. The court reasoned that the right to self-representation is a fundamental aspect of personal autonomy and the right to a fair trial. The defendant must be competent to waive their right to an attorney. This means they must understand the risks and responsibilities of self representation. The waiver of the right to counsel must be made knowingly and intelligently. The defendant should also be aware of the potential disadvantages of not having a lawyer. While defendants have the right to represent themselves, the trial court has the responsibility to ensure the defendant is aware of the risks and to ensure that the trial proceeds fairly. So, this ruling emphasized the importance of personal choice in the legal process, but also recognized that self representation is not always advisable. This decision was a balance between respecting the defendant's autonomy and ensuring a fair trial. So, all these cases continue to build upon one another. Again, I realize that this lecture is particularly case law heavy, but it's just to give you an understanding of how we have developed over time to where we are today. So, the next case law that I'm going to talk to you about is Cooper v. Oklahoma, 1996, and this affirmed the decisional component. Cooper v. Oklahoma was a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case that addressed the constitutionality of the standard for determining competency to stand trial. The case focused on whether the standard used by the state of Oklahoma violated the defendant's constitutional rights. So, a few facts about the case. James Cooper was charged with murder and faced competency hearing to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Under Oklahoma law at that time, the defendant had the burden of proving their incompetence by a clear and convincing standard of evidence. Cooper challenged the standard, arguing that it placed unfair burden on defendants and violated constitutional protections. The key issue was whether, quote, clear and convincing evidence, unquote, standard imposed on defendants to prove incompetence violated the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Cooper contended that the standard was too high and that it unfairly deprived him of a fair trial if he were, in fact, incompetent. The U.S. Supreme Court held in favor of Cooper, finding that clear and convincing standard for proving incompetence was unconstitutional. The court held that the due process rights of a defendant required that the prosecution prove a defendant's competency to stand trial by a preponderance of evidence rather than requiring the defendant to prove their incompetence. So let's talk about a couple of key issues and implications for this particular case. The Supreme Court's decision emphasized that due process clause of the 14th Amendment requires that the state bear the burden of proving a defendant's competency to stand trial. This ensures the defendants who are mentally incompetent are not subjected to trial, thereby protecting their constitutional rights. The court ruled that the appropriate standard for determining competency is the preponderance of evidence, which is lower standard than clear and convincing. This means that the state must prove the defendant's competency is more likely true than not, rather than requiring a higher level of certainty. By shifting the burden of proof to the state, the decision ensures that defendants are not unfairly required to prove their own incompetence. This aligns with the principle that individuals should not be forced to undergo a trial if they cannot understand or participate in legal processes due to mental incapacity. The ruling reinforces the notion that defendants must be mentally incompetent to stand trial, as a fair trial requires that defendants have the ability to understand the charges against them and assist in their defense. The decision led to charges in how states determine and assess competency, with many jurisdictions revising their standards and procedures to comply with the ruling. The case highlights the importance of accurate and fair assessments of competency and underscores the very important role that forensic psychologists have in evaluating defendants. So let's continue to talk about the Bonnie's conceptualization. And this is a widely recognized framework developed by legal scholar Richard J. Bonney. His conceptualization of competency emphasizes the functional abilities of a defendant within the legal context, and it aims to provide a more nuanced understanding of what it means for a defendant to be competent. Bonnie's model expands on the competency standards set by Dusky, which requires the defendant to have a rational and factual understanding of the legal proceedings and be able to assist in their own defense. Bonnie takes this further by focusing on different dimensions of legal competency, distinguishing between adjudicative competency, so competency to stand trial, and other types of legal competencies. So let's talk about the key components of Bonnie's conceptualization. This framework stresses that competency is not a general characteristic, but is context dependent. A person may be competent in some situations, such as understanding the charges against them, but not in others, such as making legal decisions like entering a plea. Competency is seen as a functional ability, and a defendant must be able to function effectively in specific legal contexts. For example, competency to stand trial requires functional capacities like understanding legal processes, communicating with counsel, and making reasoned decisions. Bonnie's competency is really broken down into two key domains. First is competency to participate in the process, also known as cognitive competency. This focuses on the defendant's ability to understand the factual elements of the trial process. It includes knowledge of the courtroom roles, such as the judge, the prosecutor, the charges, and the consequences of the trial. And then the second major component is competency to make legal decisions, also known as decisional competency. This centers on the defendant's capacity to make reasoned, autonomous decisions related to the trial, such as pleading guilty or waiving the right to counsel. It extends beyond mere understanding to the defendant's ability to weigh options and participate in their defense in a meaningful way. Bonnie makes a crucial distinction between foundational and decisional competencies. Foundational competency refers to the defendant's ability to grasp the nature and purpose of the legal proceedings. This is similar to the basic standard laid out in Dusky, where the defendant needs to understand the charges, the courtroom roles, and the trials, whereas decisional competency focuses on the ability to make informed, rational decisions during the trial. This requires the defendant to evaluate choices and consequences, such as understanding a plea bargain or deciding whether to testify. This distinction helps clarify that it's possible for a defendant to be foundationally competent, but still lack decisional competency required to make complex legal decisions. Bonnie's conceptualization also distinguishes between cognitive impairments related to a person's understanding and volitional impairments related to their ability to act on decisions. If a defendant has difficulty understanding or processing information about the trial, they may be deemed incompetent to stand trial. Even if a defendant understands the trial process, they may still lack competency if their mental health impairs their ability to make or act rational decisions, such as cooperating with counsel. With regard to threshold for decision capacity, Bonnie suggests that for certain types of decisions, such as waiving constitutional rights or entering a plea, a higher level of decisional competence must be required. It differs from the basic competency needed to merely participate in the trial. For example, a defendant who wishes to represent themselves, we saw this in the Ferretta case, must demonstrate a greater level of decision-making competence than is required for simply standing trial. Competency is not a static characteristic, and it can change over time. For instance, a defendant may become incompetent after the onset of a mental illness or regain competency after receiving treatment. Bonnie's model accommodates for this fluidity, emphasizing the need for continuous evaluation of a defendant's functional abilities throughout the legal process. So let's talk about how Bonnie's model is applied. With regard to adjudicative competency, Bonnie's model has been influential in the discussions of adjudicative competency, which refer specifically to ability to stand trial. His distinction between foundational and decisional competency has been particularly important in clarifying legal standards. Courts are increasingly recognizing that competency evaluations must go beyond basic understanding to include an assessment of whether defendants can make informed decisions about their defense. This has influenced competency assessments in both criminal and civil proceedings. Bonnie's model is particularly useful in evaluating competency to waive legal rights, such as the right to counsel or right to a jury trial. Decisional competency is crucial in these decisions, and as such, the defendant must not only understand the implications of waiving rights, but also have the capacity to make a reasoned choice. This approach has been applied to cases such as Godinez v. Moran, where the court dealt with the issue of whether competency to stand trial automatically means competency to waive counsel. Bonnie's model also plays a role in discussions about restoring competency through treatment, especially for defendants with mental illness. Restoration programs often aim to address both foundational and decisional competencies. His model helps guide decisions on whether it's ethically and legally appropriate to administer involuntary treatment to restore a defendant's competency for trial. So, let's talk about a couple of criticisms and limitations regarding Bonnie's conceptualization. It is theoretically sound, and some critics argue that it can be difficult to apply in practice. Forensic evaluators and courts may struggle to clearly differentiate between foundational and decisional competencies, especially when mental illness or cognitive impairments are involved. The distinction between foundational and decisional competencies raises the question about where to set the threshold for decisional competency, and critics argue that this threshold can be difficult to standardize across cases, leading to variability in competency rulings. There can also be tension between legal standards for competency and psychological evaluations, such as mental health professionals and legal professionals may approach the assessment of competency from different perspectives. So, to wrap it all up, Bonnie's conceptualization of competency to stand trial represents an important development in how courts and mental health professionals approach legal competencies. By distinguishing between foundational and decisional competency, Bonnie's model provides a more nuanced and functional understanding of a defendant's mental capacity in legal context. His emphasis on competency as a contextual, dynamic, and fluid ability ensures that defendants receive fair treatment in the legal system while recognizing the complex nature of mental capacity. This framework has influenced court rulings and forensic practices, making it an essential part of the discussion around adjudicative competency. So I know this lecture is chock full of information, so let's pause here. Let's do a little brief overview. Again, a summary of these particular legal competencies. Functional competence, ability to perform legal tasks such as understanding trial processes and assisting in one's own defense. Causal competence, understanding the root cause of impairment, for example, a traumatic brain injury, substance use, mental illness. Interactive competence, ability to interact appropriately with legal personnel in the court, so being able to communicate with one's attorney and following courtroom procedures. Judgmental competence, capacity to make rational decisions about legal matters such as plea deals, testifying, and waiving one's rights. And dispositional competence, ability to understand and appreciate the consequences of legal outcomes, sentencing, parole, and treatment. Forensic psychologists use these competence to guide their evaluations, ensuring that legal decisions are made on an individual's true mental state and abilities, which is vital for a fair trial and accuracy of legal proceedings. So let's talk about the questions or topics that we need to cover with our defendant within the functional component. The defendant must demonstrate a basic understanding of how the court system works and what is expected during the trial. Relevant behaviors include awareness of the courtroom roles, such as the judge, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the jury, having knowledge of the charges and potential consequences. So, understanding the plea options and the difference between guilty and not guilty is going to be very important. So, as an example, when asked, the defendant should be able to correctly identify the prosecutor's role as someone trying to prove their guilt and the defense attorney as a person who is trying to help them defend themselves. With regard to rational decision making, the defendant must be able to make reasoned decisions regarding their legal options. This includes capacity to weigh the pros and cons of accepting a plea bargain versus going to trial, understanding the consequences of decisions such as waiving the right to counsel, testifying in court, or pleading guilty. So, for example, the defendant must demonstrate the ability to reason through a decision, showing understanding of possible legal outcomes, and articulate why they choose a particular legal option. Ability to communicate with counsel, the defendant must be able to engage in a meaningful pattern of communication with their attorney to assist in their own defense. This includes their ability to articulate their version of the events related to the charges. They must be able to follow instructions and advice from counsel, and they need to be able to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of their case. For example, the defendant participates in conversations with their attorney, answers questions coherently, and expresses their concerns and preferences about trial. Falling under this as well is cooperation with their legal team. The defendant must be able to demonstrate a willingness to cooperate with their defense attorney and any other legal representatives. Relevant behaviors include engaging in meetings with the legal team and responding to their questions, providing relevant information and evidence that may assist in their behavior. For example, the defendant consistently attends meetings with their lawyer, they follow instructions, and they help gather necessary information for their defense. Here, we're going to talk about causal and interactive. With regard to causal, we talked about this before. There could be many reasons why the individual is struggling with competency, whether that is mental illness, having some type of underlying cognitive or intellectual impairment. It could be immaturity. It could be because of their education and background and lack of knowledge. And then we want to know, how treatable is this, and to what extent is this condition treatable, and how are we going to treat that? With regard to interactive, the defendant must be able to demonstrate their ability to control their emotions and maintain appropriate behavior during the trial. This is essential for them to participate in a rational manner without disrupting the processes. Relevant behaviors include remaining calm and composed in the courtroom, avoiding outbursts, aggression, or bizarre behavior. So, for example, the defendant needs to remain seated. They need to listen quietly during the legal proceedings. They need to refrain from shouting or inappropriate comments when they become upset by any of the legal proceedings. The defendant must be able to distinguish between reality versus delusions and not to be guided by hallucinations or paranoid beliefs that interfere with their ability to stand trial. So, some relevant behaviors here include displaying reality based thinking and not being influenced by irrational fears. So, say, for example, believing that the judge is part of a conspiracy against them. We also need to ensure the absence of paranoid delusions that distort the understanding of their case or their ability to participate with their defense. Example behavior is that the defendant does not express irrational beliefs about the trial, such as notions that the legal system is a covert operation who's targeting them. Next, we need to talk about memory and cognitive functioning. The defendant must have sufficient memory to recall the facts surrounding the alleged offense and to assist their defense by remembering important events. This may include the ability to recall personal details and facts about the case. They need to be able to demonstrate logical thinking and consistency in recounting events. So, some example behavior would include the defendant can describe where they were and what they were doing when the crime took place, and accurately discuss their interactions with witnesses or police. And the importance of assessing these forensically relevant behaviors is going to, again, ensure that the defendant is competent to stand trial, guaranteeing that they receive a fair trial and that they must be able to engage in their defense meaningfully. A trial involving incompetent defendants risk violating due process and could lead to wrongful convictions. The defendant is found incompetent, they may receive treatment or interventions aimed at restoring their competency so that they can eventually participate in the legal proceedings. A few other elements here are just understanding the complexity of the charges against them, the range of various different penalties that could apply to them, and the likelihood of each penalty, the context around the event, the evidence available without the defendant's report, the complexity of the defense, the need for the defendant to potentially testify, the length of the trial, as well as how complex the trial could become. Hopefully, the individual has some type of social support during the trial. And then also, as we mentioned, this trial could potentially become very activating for the individual. So, making sure that they can keep their behavior relevant and appropriate for the court. All right, we've talked about a ton of information in today's lecture. So, what's going to be important? What is going to be relevant? The diagnosis of a mental illness or a cognitive impairment is always going to be relevant. Whenever we think about developmental status, thinking about one's childhood, their upbringing into adolescence, especially when it comes to developmental immaturity, this is going to be very important as well. We need to know about the individual's legally relevant abilities. This is going to be extremely important. Some forensic tools that we have at our disposal are going to be the MacArthur Competency Assessment Tool for Criminal Adjudication, as well as the fitness interview test. Utilizing these two measures will be of great importance to you, as well as when you get out into the field, there may be others that you're exposed to and may be particularly preferential to you. But nonetheless, these are going to be two that we focus on a little bit here, and just knowing that there are tools available to you. With regard to testing, psychological testing, it's rarely necessary to employ personality measures, and a WAIS, a Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, is generally sufficient if there's a question of a cognitive ability. Some of the other psych testing we're going to talk about is going to come more relevant as we talk about other things, not necessarily competency to stand trial. All right, we are finally here. We are going to conduct the evaluation. With the diagnostic interview, the primary question here is the symptomology sufficient to interfere with forensically relevant behavior? This is generally not as extensive as what you might need to do in other types of cases, such as, for example, criminal responsibility. We want to know, can the individual engage in forensically relevant behavior? What does he or she have to do? What's expected of them? What are they able to do? What are the potential outcomes if they can or cannot engage in these various different types of behaviors? Do they understand the potential outcomes? Do they appreciate the outcomes? Can the individual communicate sufficiently? And can they both understand and express themselves? These are all components that you're going to need to assess during your time with the defendant. And at the end of the day, the judge makes the call. If someone is not competent, they're typically referred for competency restoration. And this process refers to helping a defendant who has been deemed incompetent to stand trial regain the necessary mental, cognitive, and emotional abilities to participate in legal proceedings. The goal is to ensure that the defendant can understand the legal process, communicate with their attorney, and make informed decisions regarding their defense. So let's talk about what competency restoration looks like. First and foremost, we have to have an initial evaluation of competency. So, before competency restoration can begin, a forensic psychologist must conduct a competency evaluation to determine whether the defendant is competent to stand trial or not. If the defendant is incompetent, the court orders competency restoration to attempt to bring the defendant to a level where they can meet legal standards of competence. Competency restoration is legally required once a defendant is found incompetent to ensure that due process rights are upheld. Under the Supreme Court ruling in Jackson v. Indiana, 1972, defendants can only be held for a reasonable amount of time necessary to determine whether there is a substantial probability that competency can be restored. So let's talk about some methods for restoring competency. Competency restoration generally involves psychological, psychiatric, and educational interventions designed to address the underlying issues that render the defendant incompetent. This may include a combination of psychopharmacological treatment for defendants with mental illness, especially those with severe psychiatric conditions such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Medication is going to play a central role in competency restoration. Individuals may be prescribed antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, or antidepressants to stabilize symptoms such as delusions, hallucinations, or severe mood disturbances that impair the defendant's ability to understand the legal proceedings. A defendant experiencing delusions about a judge being part of a conspiracy may receive antipsychotic medication to reduce these symptoms to allow them to understand the role of the judge more clearly and to reduce any part of this paranoid and delusional thinking. Psychological therapy, such as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other forms of psychotherapy, may be used to help the defendant manage symptoms of anxiety, depression, and paranoia. Therapy may also focus on improving communication skills, emotion regulation, and addressing thought distortions that affect one's ability to participate in trial. For example, a defendant with anxiety that prevents them from communicating with their attorney may receive therapy to reduce anxiety and improve their capacity to engage with their legal defense. Next is education about legal proceedings. Defendants undergo legal education sessions to help them better understand court procedures, the roles of different courtroom participants, such as the judge, the jury, the prosecutor, the nature of the charges, and the possible outcomes of their case. These educational programs are usually tailored to the defendant's cognitive abilities and learning style, ensuring that they can grasp basic legal concepts. So, for example, a defendant with cognitive impairments may be provided simplified explanations and role playing exercises to help them learn what happens during a trial and how they can work with their lawyer. Cognitive training and skill development. If a defendant has cognitive deficits such as memory problems, impaired attention, or poor reasoning, targeted cognitive trainings may be employed. These include exercises designed to improve cognitive functioning, like attention span, decision making, and impulse control. For example, a defendant who has difficulty focusing during legal discussions may engage in cognitive training activities that improve their ability to sustain attention and make reasoned decisions. As far as restoration programs, these could potentially be inpatient or outpatient. For defendants with significant psychiatric or cognitive impairments, inpatient programs in secure psychiatric hospitals or treatment facilities may be necessary. These facilities provide 24/7 medical and psychological care, as well as regular competency training. Inpatient programs are used for individuals who are potentially dangerous or require intensive psychiatric stabilization. For example, a defendant with acute psychosis who poses a risk to themselves or others may be placed in an inpatient facility to receive intensive treatment and constant monitoring. Some defendants may participate in outpatient programs while living in the community or in a correctional facility. These programs offer psychiatric treatment, therapy, and legal education on a scheduled basis. Outpatient programs are generally reserved for defendants with less severe impairments who are deemed stable enough to function outside of a hospital setting. A defendant with moderate depression who is responsive to medication may attend weekly outpatient sessions for therapy and legal education while awaiting trial. Throughout the restoration process, forensic psychologists assess the defendant's progress towards competency, and this involves periodic reevaluations to determine if the defendant can understand the charges in the trial process, communicate effectively with their attorney, and make rational decisions related to their defense. These assessments help guide treatment adjustments and determine whether the defendant is ready to go to trial. With regard to time frame, the duration of competency restoration varies depending upon the individual's mental health condition and response to treatment. Minor cases of incompetency, such as mild depression or anxiety, may be resolved in a few months, whereas more complex cases, such as severe schizophrenia or cognitive impairments, may take much longer. If competency is not restored within a reasonable period of time, the court must determine whether they are going to dismiss the charges. This may be the case in minor cases, civilly commit the defendant to a mental health facility if they are a danger to themselves or others, continue treatment with the goal of future restoration. There are some ethical and legal considerations when it comes to restoration. Ethical guidelines must be followed to ensure that the defendant's rights are respected. In cases where defendants may refuse treatment, particularly psychotropic medications, courts must balance the defendant's autonomy with the state's interest in bringing the individual to trial. In some cases, involuntary medication may be administered if the court finds it necessary to restore competency, as outlined in Cell v. United States, 2003, which provides criteria for when involuntary medication is permissible. Potential outcomes of competency restoration may be that their competency is restored, that their condition improves, they are deemed competent, and they go to trial. Unsuccessful restoration: if after a reasonable period of time the defendant remains incompetent, the court may dismiss the charges or take alternative actions such as civil commitment, like we just talked about, or interim decisions. In some cases, if competency cannot be restored quickly, but progress is being made, the court may extend the restoration process. Some challenges in competency restoration are that some defendants may refuse treatment, particularly, like we mentioned, taking medications, which is going to make restoration extremely difficult. Certain mental illnesses, such as severe personality disorders or treatment resistant psychosis, may make restoration very highly challenging, if not impossible. For defendants with progressive cognitive conditions, such as dementia, restoration may be impractical due to the irreversible decline of such conditions. So, to wrap it all up, competency restoration is a crucial part of ensuring defendants who are unable to stand trial due to mental health or cognitive issues receive the treatment and support they need to participate meaningfully in legal processes. The restoration process combines psychiatric treatment, legal education, therapy, and cognitive training to address the underlying factors of incompetence. Ultimately, it serves a dual purpose of protecting the defendant's rights and maintaining the integrity of the legal system. So, earlier you heard me mention Jackson v. Indiana, 1972. We're going to talk a little bit about this case and what happens if you really can't restore competency. This particular case was a landmark Supreme Court case that established important legal principles regarding indefinite confinement of individuals deemed incompetent to stand trial. This ruling helped to safeguard the due process rights of defendants who are mentally ill or intellectually disabled, ensuring that they cannot be held indefinitely without trial if there is no likelihood of their competency being restored. A little bit of background on this case: Milton Jackson, a deaf, mute, and mentally disabled African American male, was charged with 2 counts of robbery. Due to his profound impairments, 2 court-appointed psychiatrists found him incompetent to stand trial because he could not understand the charges against him or participate in his defense. Indiana law allowed Jackson to be committed indefinitely to a state mental hospital without any further proceedings, meaning he could potentially remain institutionalized for life without ever receiving trial or treatment aimed at restoring his competency. Jackson challenged this commitment, arguing that it violated his 14th Amendment rights to due process and equal protection. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Jackson, holding that indefinite commitment violates due process. The court ruled that a defendant who is found incompetent to stand trial cannot be indefinitely committed to a mental institution without periodic evaluations and without some likelihood that their competency can be restored. If there is no reasonable probability that the individual will regain competency in the foreseeable future, the state cannot hold them indefinitely. The court must either release the individual or pursue civil commitment under appropriate state laws, which provide more protections and periodic reviews. The court also found that Jackson was being treated differently than other individuals under civil commitment laws, who are entitled to more procedural safeguards and regular reviews of their mental condition. This differential treatment violated Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So, a few key points of this decision is that the state may hold an individual for a reasonable period of time to determine whether their competence can be restored. However, this cannot be indefinite. If it is clear that an individual will not regain competency, further confinement is unconstitutional. If a defendant is unlikely to regain competency, the state must either initiate civil commitment procedures, which involve more stringent due process protections, or release the individual. This ruling put an end to the practice of indefinitely detaining mentally incompetent defendants without a trial. States must now ensure that individuals are either restored to competency or transferred to appropriate mental health treatment through civil commitment. The impact of Jackson v. Indiana is that this case reinforced the constitutional rights of individuals found incompetent to stand trial, emphasizing that they cannot be left in legal limbo and must be treated in a way that respects their rights and due process and equal protection. After Jackson, states were required to periodically reassess a defendant's competency status and either provide treatment aimed at restoring competency or pursue civil commitment if necessary. The decision led to reforms in how the criminal justice system deals with mentally incompetent defendants. It emphasized the need for treatment focused approaches rather than indefinite institutionalization without trial. So, to wrap it all up, Jackson v. Indiana set a vital legal precedent, ensuring that defendants who are found incompetent to stand trial cannot be held indefinitely without efforts to restore their competency. It underscored the importance of periodic evaluations and appropriate legal processes to protect individuals' constitutional rights, shaping the intersection of criminal law and mental health treatment in the United States. I know that there was a lot of information in this lecture. I hope that you enjoyed it. Competency to stand trial is one of my favorite forensic evaluations. I really enjoy doing these, and it was a pleasure to teach you today. Again, I know this was a ton of information, but you're doing excellent. You're learning a lot, and next time we meet, we're going to continue to build upon this education and knowledge even more. I'll see you next time.